needs us.
Can we set something up in the middle? Put the comments in the back.
To dominate everywhere, right? And if we don't dominate everywhere,
This is the best.
Are you No.
and so that had a lot of.
Okay, you're in somebody. I finished my PhD a couple years ago.
So I just
What's optimal?
Oh, where?
So can I see? So mainly.
Yes, Salvador, yes. Yeah, and I have a good Bayano friend.
What are we broadcasting?
Collaborator, George Alvi. Actually, he's in Salvador.
John knows
Queens College in New York, but his family he's down there. But yeah, and a lot of the people who do some interesting work on how things that I'm working on are from No, I mean, I'm trained as a sociologist, but I'm involved in international studies here. So,
make sure that.
I remember, so when you were here 4 years ago, you were finishing I remember Sun Beach. Yeah. I remember thinking you're
So people might actually present paper.
What's that? Because I lost track of the New York so that's next fall, yeah.
But can I move the
yeah.
What if I when you say
meeting
number
us like
around,
what in the spring when did it
set it up so it's
maybe
what about in terms of
And then so that's what I can tell.
how much is the mic going to pick up? How much is the mic going to pick up?
yeah.
So
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
Good.
Hey, John. Welcome. Come on in. You made it.
So should we just start this with this?
These are these. Yeah, we can do you guys are live.
Okay. Okay. I'm going to start over.
So if you catch that share for this show.
Oh my God.
So I'm not sure that that's gonna. I'm not sure. Send an email that you guys can receive the email.
So have you already moved to Salvador? Or you're actually the profit?
So this is what's now.
Would it be best to be the other end though? I'm thinking now people coming in next. I think so.
It's pretty good because we have this kind of.
Yeah, but
Honestly, I actually think we should turn the camera around and just have the whole, and just try and capture the whole space because people are going to stay in their seats when they present their papers, aren't they? Or, I mean, we're not going to just shuffle around in the seats the whole time.
Trying to remember this guy's name.
Yeah, I don't. You're here outside. Too far to pick up the word.
Maxwell, you made it.
They sent us up there. Oh, hi.
Here. How you doing, Chris?
Hey, you just stole my coffee.
Oh, I had a couple.
Yeah, that's it's.
Yeah.
Right, I'm sorry.
You made it. Thank God. How did you get here?
Yeah, just I drove.
Hello.
Aaron, how are you?
very good. How are you?
Well,
It's I'm back in my stocking boots.
yeah, exactly. Hey,
Yeah, we're still working on. We're trying to make sure that everybody who's actually presenting has chairs. So we're just sort of starting through that.
Yeah, maybe I can drag it over there.
You might be able to draw this.
Yeah, grab some chairs. It'll be fantastic.
I'm still trying to work out.
Let me just quickly walk you through. So, basically, it's so light. Okay. And that's what it is in the stand, double stand, because I didn't have a plastic cover.
Yeah, I was in profile
So that it should be live.
I think they were on storage.
So I do recommend
So still, so yeah, we need to hear who in there. We still have some presenters who are still not right. We're running short of chairs.
So this is a so basically the line here.
And I don't know how this is going to work, but I don't think maybe we do. For everybody, and we'll solve that question. So yeah.
Whose stuff is this? Well, it's yours?
Okay, I'm going to be on here because I could get you busy soon.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So just get my name. Just pick it up and you drive.
Okay.
So basically,
You want your computer in. It doesn't all matter. Just
where's Max down?
Where's Max gone?
What?
Where is Max gone?
Because some of Max's grad students, right? So, hey Max. Can you tell me,
Let's
okay, and so we have Renato, we have Roberto, we have John, we have Eric, Max, we have Alejandro. Where's Alejandro? Is that Alejandro? Okay. John Beasley-Murray. Gives a good time.
It's great. It's great.
And so we have Alejandro. We still need space for John Harris.
You guys meeting in the chair so he doesn't show up?
So the other good mighty guy to make sure you have an extension cord to plug in your laptop.
Yeah, there's a thing on the first floor.
Me up here?
Thank you.
Okay.
So we're still waiting on Hannah. So we are so we they might have to go through seats. We might have to find one.
Where would we find the chairs?
We could probably look at the customer.
So, just to say, with the snow and everything, we're a little behind, but we'll get going in about 5-10 minutes. Okay, we're finding some more chairs. Is the current thing.
Yeah, let me show you. Yep, exactly. Got the camera. So this is the feed. It's going live. Yes.
So John, he's going to use them, but I'm not sure why you.
Yes.
Okay. I think John was better than. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, they're much different than being in Iran. So we have to try a lot to make sure. Layout. So that kind of thing is more challenging.
He's not paying rent.
Oh, there's nothing there right on here, too.
Oh, thank you. Okay, you get that. Okay, thanks, Larry. Larry is the director of the administrative
And then maybe some more.
Hey, good to see you. It's so glad you could make it. Thank you so much for
He's I'm scrambling a little bit.
I guess.
To my mind, it's the only way that it could proceed.
So, when did you get here?
Oh, I got here.
It's so long. It's unbelievable.
I got here Saturday morning.
Saturday morning.
Stupid job.
You left on Thursday night.
Friday night, but I left my house. Friday morning. And that's kind of like it was 5 in the morning here.
It's crazy, yeah. It's a long trip. There's no question about it.
Is somebody pregnant?
So you're next down? Chris what? Chris, yeah, right.
I'm upstairs. I'm out.
Oh, okay.
Opening remarks at 9:30.
Oh, yeah, so that's true.
Oh, how are you doing?
Now whose coffees are
Fantastic.
I'll take this one. Okay, oh, I got it. Okay, we don't want to. Perfect.
So, folks, if I can have your attention, please. I hate to do this sort of fully defined thing, but if you're not presenting or commenting on at the conference, we'd appreciate it if there's still some presenters coming in and they need to be seated. They need to be seated at the table. So we're trying to set up chairs around the outside for you. But if you're not either commenting, chairing, or presenting, we'd really appreciate it if you left spaces at the table and occupy. I know that seems so hierarchical. It really does. But this is about the end of the life, right? So we're setting up. You're welcome to the coffee. You're welcome to join us for lunch. But we need to be able to create space at the table for people who are presenting or who are chairing or commenting. So I just appreciate that. Thank you very much.
That's right. My first official act is
Excellent.
to be a hall monitor.
Yeah, well, that's what running things like this involves.
So so you drove in then, eh?
Yeah,
What a nightmare this morning.
it was like down those hills.
Oh, sure. I mean, once you get down into downtown, it's all right, but
Downtown.
I think it's going to start raining.
Yeah, it'll be better by the evening. It was great snow at home. Unbelievable. Just so nice.
You missed a good party. You missed a good party.
I know.
It was a lot of fun. We had a good
What's up?
time.
Good.
But you had to do your thing. So we have a couple.
Maybe go cozy date chance.
Thank you. It's a workshop on the fate of the Latin What a day to do that! Oh my God!
I have just one question. Is there any chance of getting an extension course?
Yes.
But you know, surely one of these cups of coffee is mine.
What's this?
I said, surely one of these cups of coffee is mine.
There's still lots of things.
Are we good?
Do you know what we're doing?
We're going to talk. So when we start, let me just do a few logistical things and tell people where dinner. Dinner's going to be at our house. And I think we're going to lose. A lot of the participants. So I think we could invite. I think we still got 5 minutes. We still got 5 minutes today.
Yeah, but okay, but I think the first thing I do, given this little workshop thing, is to do a round of introductions.
I think that's a great idea. And we're still waiting on Leslie.
Yep.
And I don't have a copy of that. Do we want people to come up and present up here so that they're on the screen?
I think we do.
All right.
Okay, so that'll be my seat, and I'm just here for the beginning of this.
Hi. So I'm just going to go play this now. Hi. Hey, Hannah. Hi, how are you? Welcome.
Come on in and get yourself a seat.
There is, but there's a couple of seats over there. Hey, how's it going?
This is the way
Nuno's here. Nuno's here.
I'm just
I'll just rove around. I have no need to fix He missed a good party, I tell you.
How are you?
It was a great party. Fantastic party.
How do you get down here?
We'll have another little party.
Walk. Oh, because you live nearby.
I live by English, right?
Yeah.
Just to stroll. Should kind of get a buzz. So we're just waiting on left.
We drove, and I'll tell you, driving from UBC was not a lot of fun.
I guess you and I can start.
Sure, I can.
Why don't we get started on the introduction?
Yeah.
And see. So Max, I'm gonna start the introduction.
I think we're just waiting on Leslie, but we're waiting on Leslie, but she'll be good.
Good to see you.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, those of you who just had to come across Hastings Street this morning, you have no idea of the pain and agony the rest of us have gone through to get through this morning. I'm so glad to see so many people on a day when literally, I mean, the great thing is they say, leave your cars at home, right? Because all the roads become impassable. One thing about the city is that we can't deal with anything, right? We're unable to deal with any kind of weather. I mean, we always rely on the rain to wash everything away, and it's a kind of a hilly city, and there's no snow plows, and our buses are unable to get up a grade that is more than 1.5%. Our buses are like trains, in effect. They have no traction on them. So on a day like today, the city is basically impossible. I listened to the weather report when I got up this morning. The weather report lasted, the traffic report lasted 45 minutes because they basically named every street in the entire city. Said that's impossible, that's impossible, that's not. And North Vancouver evidently is an even greater disaster because North Vancouver is built on a mountain, right?
Snow around us and all this.
Oh my God! I mean, and so they say leave your car at home, take the bus. But it turns out that the buses are the things that are blocking all the roads because the buses can't get up. So those of us who rely on public transport this morning had a very trying effort to get here. And so I thank you for coming. I thank you for your interest. So come on in. And I'm very excited. I'm very excited about what's going on. But since there's one bit of business that I wanted to take care of right at the start, and that is to say that after the workshop today, we're going to have a dinner at my house, which is in Dunbar. Hopefully the rain which is coming in the next hour or so will have washed all the snow away, and we'll be back to just our normal miserable selves by then. But everyone is invited. It's at 8 o'clock. Our address is 3215 Dunbar Street.
8 or 7?
8 o'clock. It's at 8. No, it's at 8. No, because we're going to finish here at 6:30, right?
Yeah.
So
Okay.
come anytime after 7:30. What?
Anytime.
Come anytime. Come anytime. Our children will entertain you with snow angels or dirt angels, whatever. Our house is easily got to. It's on King Edward Ave. If you're going by public transport from here, you just take the Canada line to the King Edward Ave station, and you get on the 25. The 25 takes you literally right to our house. There's a bus stop right in front of our house. It's the corner of Balaclava and 25th. I know that unfortunately, I big timed the people who weren't presenting by asking you to sit in the sides, but you are welcome to come to dinner. So please do come to dinner and eat all the food in an act of resistance to having been forced to sit on the edges today. So please do come. There's going to be plenty of food. And it'll allow us to continue the conversation we're having into the evening. Again, 3215 King Edward Avenue West, Beasley, corner of King Ed and Balaclava. Anytime, just once we wrap up here, anytime. But what I thought we would do, or actually what John thought we would do, is we would start by just quickly going around the room and everybody introducing themselves. Some people are unfamiliar to one another. Like, for instance, most of you probably have no idea who I am. My name is Alec Dawson. I work here at Simon Fraser University, mostly in custodial services. If you are traveling and we have paid for your travel, I need your receipts. I need your what do you call them? Boarding passes. And make sure you talk to me at some point during today, because I'm going to need to get you to sign a form. The person who has the forms is currently trapped on a Millennium Line train somewhere in New Westminster, fuming about modernity. But I will have those forms for you to sign sometime, probably around lunch. So make sure, if you're traveling and we have arranged your travel, or we have arranged your accommodation, make sure you talk to me and I get you to sign the form and you get the forms from me. Anyways, my name is Alec Dawson. Let's start by going around the outside and then we can go around the inside. So.
Okay. Leslie Armijo. I work with Alec in international studies. I teach development. Is that sufficient?
Perfectly.
Well, I'm Natalia Escobar, and I'm a high school student.
It's a PD day.
Yeah, that's right.
Hi, I'm Ari de la Mora, and actually I'm an artist, I'm a painter, but all my subjects are related to Mexico and Latin America.
Hi, my name is Intiang Lee. I'm a second-year PhD student at BBC. I'm a student of maths, and I'm here to support these big guys in front of me. And I'm studying comparative politics, hopefully comparative between Asia and Latin America. And I'm actually very proud to be here as the only Asian in the room.
I'm Katya. I'm a third-year master's student in the International Studies Department. I'm working on a thesis on repression and gang violence in El Salvador. So the fact that the left is now perpetrating the same state violence that they fought against 20 years ago is very interesting to me. So, yes.
John?
Hi, I'm John Beasley-Murray. I teach at UBC, and that's it.
I'm Fabio Resmini. I'm a PhD student, second year at the University of British Columbia.
My name is Dominique. Also, I'm a PhD student at UBC.
Part of this team. My name is Alec. We're all from UBC, PhD students as well.
Gerardo Otero, I teach at International Studies here at Simon Fraser.
Eric Hirschberg, I'm at Mountain University in Washington. I preceded Alec in custodial services here at Simon Fraser some years ago.
I'm Juan Hernandez. I'm a PhD candidate here at the Department of French and Spanish Studies at UBC, working with John.
I'm Gerardo Munoz, and I'm a PhD candidate at Princeton University and working on some questions related to the state in Latin America and contemporary Italian political philosophy.
My name is John Harris. I also suffer with Alexander Dawson in custodial services or whatever it is. And I'm an interloper here because I am not a Latin Americanist. I work in and on India. I think my sort of service in Latin America amounts to some total of about 10 days. So expect some expert opinions from me.
I'm Alejandro. I'm originally from Chile, but I came to Canada a long, long time ago with a Pinochet scholarship. The scholarship without return. I am a recently retired professor at UBC in the Faculty of Land and Food Systems. And yeah.
Good morning, everyone. I am Pilar Reñas and I teach at UBC.
I'm Gabriel Saldias. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at UBC working on Latin American literature.
Hi everyone, I'm Carolina. I'm from Chile. I work with John and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at UBC, Latin American Studies.
Hi, my name is Carlos. I am a PhD student at Dawson University in Spanish literature.
Good morning. My name is Nuno Porto, and I'm a curator at the Museum of Anthropology.
I'm Hannah Whitman. I was formerly at Custodial Services here at SFU, but now I'm at ABC and Land Institutions.
Hi, my name is Annalisa. I am a PhD in political science from Brazil.
I'm Alejandro Velasco. I teach history at York University.
I'm Alejandro Bronfman and I teach history at UBC.
I'm Renato Francischini. I was a former visiting graduate student at UBC with Mark Warren, and now I'm a professor at the University of Bahia in Brazil, just moving from Santa Catarina to Bahia, and I study political theory, political democracy and stuff.
Hi, I'm Chris Gibson, and I'm an assistant professor upstairs in the School for International Studies.
And I'm Max Cameron, Department of Political Science at UBC.
Fabulous. Well, welcome everyone. We are going to spend just a couple minutes. Supposedly, John and Max and I are going to frame the conversation and talk about. I think that John and Max are probably going to say things that are far more erudite than anything that I might have to say this morning. So I will be very brief, and maybe I'll start. So you will have forgotten what I said by the time they finish. I want to say. So, oh, by the way, I think that we're being broadcast live on YouTube as we do this thing. So we might ask the presenters to come up and make their presentations staring into this camera so that literally one person in the National Security Association.
Three are watching at the moment.
From the National Security Administration can watch. I want to talk a little bit about why we elected to have this workshop. Of course, we all understood very clearly that Fidel Castro was going to pass away and Donald Trump was going to be elected president of the United States, and that we thought maybe it was we were at the last of last spring, and we were talking about contemporary politics. We were particularly talking a lot at the last of last spring in New York. There was a lot of talk about what many people characterize as the coup, the recent change in administration in Brazil. Increasingly, I think the common. In common parlance, it's increasingly accepted to use the word coup to describe what happened, especially as more and more information and as the catastrophe that is contemporary Brazilian politics has been unfolding. It's been clearer that a dramatic and not unprecedented, but certainly unexpected shift has been underway in a number of Latin American societies, particularly a number of that sort of. Were described, for better or worse, as participants in a project that was called the Left Turn. We were talking about that in part because about 10 years, was it 10 years ago now? When was the conference? 2008, 8 years ago. 2009. 2009. 7 years ago. 7 years ago, Max and John and Eric had organized a workshop mostly at UBC. It was all at UBC. I remember the catering was quite.
No, there's two. There's one there, one here.
Okay. There were two workshops, and I think they were 2007 and 8.
Okay, so I got that totally wrong.
Or else 8 or 9, the book came out in 10.
Yeah, we are such historians. Okay, so there were these workshops called the Left Turns, where a bunch of people came together to talk about what seemed to be a significant unfolding political post-Cold War transition in Latin America, where across the region, not just left parties, but left governments had come into power, most notably when Lula was elected in 2003? 2002?
Took off.
2003? He took off in 2003. Okay, see that I was right. And it sort of seemed like that conference had been this very kind of optimistic, like what's going on, what are the transitions, how do we define, how do we use terms, how do we talk about democracy? And it just really seemed like a very interesting opportunity, a moment that we could all sort of come together, and the historians in the room could say, ha ha, you were wrong. And we would use it as an opportunity to demonstrate why historians really know more than other people, understand the world better than other people. But you're looking at me like that's not what we're going to do. So it turns out we're not going to do that after all. And really, more significantly, we have an opportunity, or we seem to have an opportunity, to consider where we were then and where we are now by having some of the same people come together in a conversation and just kind of reflect on how it is that we got here. And that's why we invited you all to come. That's why we've organized it in the way that we have. And I'm mostly excited to hear what people have to say, what they have to reflect about where we are now, and where we're going. So that's my brief little introduction.
Sure. Well, let me just start by saying that I think that the study of Latin American politics has always been remarkably fruitful. It's through, and it's scholars in the region, it's scholars studying the region have generated some of the most important ideas in the social sciences, whether it's dependency theory, 1970s, the literature on bureaucratic authoritarianism, transitions to democracy, the quality of democracy, debates around neoliberalism, increasingly debates around indigenous peoples. Latin America has always generated some of the most interesting ideas, most important ideas in the social sciences. And so what I would hope that we would do in this context would be to stand back at a moment of that, we've suggested that this may be, in some sense, an end, at least of certain left turns. But it seems that we're at an important juncture for the region. And I think that that's a good moment for us to stand back and think more broadly about the region. Think about some of the larger themes that have always interested and animated scholars studying Latin America. Themes such as the insertion of the region into the global economy, the nature of its relationships with the global international economic order. We have a long tradition in Latin America of the study of populism, the rise of populism, the reactions it produces. This is a moment in which I think we're going to see in the next few years a lot of interest in populism, not just in Latin America, but around the world. And the debates on Latin America, I think, will be very influential as we grapple with the meaning of populism in the current context. One of the themes in the earlier book that we did together, the edited book on Latin America, was around pacts and the coming apart of certain kinds of pacts. And I think it's worth revisiting that discussion, which goes back to an earlier literature on the transitions to democracy. There's a debate that's beginning to sort of bubble up to the surface around incorporation. The Colliers have done some, as I'm sure you all know, work on incorporation of labor at an earlier historical moment. Now there's some discussion of whether Latin American left turns have constituted a kind of new incorporation. And I think that's something that is worth thinking through. There's also a debate around the state of democracy in the region. Are some countries veering toward some version of electoral authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism? People like Levitsky and Loxton have argued that populism has tended in that direction. And of course, that echoes an earlier debate on the political consequences of populism and the state of democracy. I know that a couple of years ago there was an interesting paper that was published in the Latin American Politics and Society journal, important journal of Latin American politics, by Luna Murillo and Schrenk, which was sort of about political economy and the future of Latin America. And kind of the thrust of their argument was that we're kind of, as we look at rise of populism, the commodity boom, and so forth, there's a kind of a sense for many Latin Americanists of deja vu. And yet, when you think of the great scholars who have shaped the field, people like Hirschman and O'Donnell, Cardoso, increasingly, at least in political science, and I think in some of the other social sciences, there's been a tendency toward more narrow-gauged questions, data mining, increasingly sophisticated, methods-driven, and less context sensitive research. And we're not asking some of the sort of larger questions that these great scholars did at an earlier time. And so maybe it's time. And I think this workshop then is an opportunity for us to kind of revisit some of those larger questions. And so I would encourage all of us to sort of do that, to think about patterns of democracy, dependency and development, states, inequality, indigenous people. These are sort of big questions. And I think one of the things that a workshop like this can do is to kind of put those back on the agenda and invite people to stand back. And as we look at left turns and maybe they're coming to an end, what does this tell us about some of the larger trends and how can we revisit some of those earlier debates and think about what we have learned or not from history?
Okay, briefly, my thoughts. I'd also point out that we have in this program, of which there may not be enough copies, but there's certainly a number of copies around. Amongst other things, we have the series of questions that we sent to the speakers. As we say here, these are just prompts, right? And they're not meant to be exhaustive, merely starting points for discussion, debate. At least one of the papers explicitly takes issue with one of the prompts, and we're pleased about that, right? In other words, just beginnings and just something to get the discussion going. And the more that people take issue with these thoughts or say that they're wrong-headed or that we should be thinking about other things, the better. But at least the idea is also with this brief little series of mini presentations to try and put some things on the table. The other thing I'd say is that somewhat what like Max was saying, one of the interesting things that many of us found about the so-called left turns was that it was a series of experiments, right? A series of experiments about doing things differently. There are different reasons why Latin America was the place where that could take place. We wanted in the last workshop, or the last workshops that we did, to, I guess, to counter our starting point, I suppose, was counter this notion that the sort of the radical left and the moderate left, and that was all that there was. We wanted to point to, I guess, the multiplicity of things that were going on in Latin America, the ways in which this was, yes, a sort of a laboratory of new ways of doing politics, new ways of thinking about the role of the state, new ways of trying to think about the relationship between, I don't know, class, people, multitude, and so on and so forth. I hope that today what we're not doing, what we're not witnessing, is an obituary for the left. Although, you know, there's something of that sort of evaluation of what seems to be the end of a phase. I'm also interested in what we can hold on to and what continues even if perhaps is now bubbling under the surface over the next few years. I'm also interested in the way in which, as both Max and Alec were suggesting, we might look to Latin America to think about processes that are happening elsewhere. Just as Latin America was, I guess, inspirational for many movements, for instance, the whole movement of the so-called movement of the squares, right? Plaza del Sol in Spain, Plaza Sintagma in Greece, and so on, Podemos, and so on and so forth. We're looking to the Latin American experience as something to learn from and perhaps build on. Again, perhaps unfortunately, now we look to Latin America in terms of something that futures that we may fear, right, too, in terms of the rise of these new rights or new ways in which the right articulates itself. So either way, what happens in Latin America is not, I think, merely a regional issue, but also something that is in some ways global. But we'll see what John has to say about that at the end of the day. So we're very excited that everyone's here. We've got a cozy space, which is good. We hope it doesn't become too cramped and cozy, but we're okay at the moment. There's coffee. There'll be further refreshments throughout the day before we get to the big bash at Alec and Alejandro's. As Alex says we do have this camera here. We've got this sort of experiment in what is live streaming and then will become recorded. So I guess if you were able to, when you're giving your papers, to come to the front and sit where Alec is currently sitting now, then that will enable that to happen. But otherwise, don't worry about it. We don't want the technology to get in the way of what we hope will be a productive and intense day of discussion, debate, learning, and all those good things. Anything else we need to say? Practicality?
I think that sort of sums it up. Sums it up nicely.
Okay. Well, we do have a little 5 minutes if we want to.
Well, before we sort of set up, I think maybe we could open it up. I mean, the people who have come to this room have been brought to this room because of your particular investment in a series of questions, and we would love to, if others have opening comments that they'd like to introduce to the, yeah, Eric.
So just a couple of things, and I think that was a very helpful introduction. The first thing is going back to the conferences, the workshops that we did 7-8 years ago, and the book that came out of it. I think a crucial conclusion, but also a crucial point of departure, was that there was not a single left turn, right? That there were multiple things going on and that were different things. And also that some of what was going on and that in some quarters was being deemed part of a left turn or left turns was actually perhaps not that. I mean, there was a real question as to whether some of what we were seeing in terms of governing projects in Latin America were not manifestations of a left turn, but rather manifestations of what political scientists would talk about as standard alternation in power, right? And so I think there's a little bit of a risk of forgetting our point of departure nearly a decade ago. It's not clear that all of what became frequently known as left turns was actually that, right? One. The second thing is, John said that while we're not talking about an obituary, but at the same time, I think at one point Max talked about a cycle coming to an end, right? Well, fair enough on both of those, but I think it's tempting now to talk about the end of the left turn, singular, or of the left turns, when actually my sense is that we have a very mixed landscape, that some of what constituted that phase of political change is still very much in place. And part of what is interesting at this point is to try to distinguish what are the elements of continuity and or continued development, and what are the elements of interruption or rupture, or even regression, right? And I think that in asking that, it's useful to go back to the initial frame of multiple left turns.
I am just reminded as we begin that it's not just that, but another sort of very significant event that is unfolding right now is the signing of the peace accord. Is the Colombian Congress actually, and in an odd way, a country that didn't at all participate in the political shift to the left, or didn't in any meaningful way, actually at this moment where we will talk dismally about what's going on in a number of contexts, we should somehow think about this other thing that has happened that represents a significant movement away from a long-standing conflict and towards the peaceful resolution of that context, and how we integrate that into our sort of thought about this process, is not. Other comments before we have a quick cup of coffee and move and play musical chairs? Yeah.
Quick reflection to support what the colleague just said. I think that the landscape in Latin America is so fluid and so complex and so contradictory that it's very difficult to talk about a left turn or the end of a left turn. I think that I'm thinking of some of the silences in the program, and this is certainly not a criticism to the organizers, but it would be important to have a perspective on what's going on in Bolivia, for example. what's going on in Ecuador, what's happening with Nicaragua, and Ortega is still the leader, right? What had happened with Brazil? Brazil is there, of course, but I'm always puzzled. I was very involved in the Chilean politics of the end of the 60s and during the Allende government. And I'm not involved anymore, like directly. I mean, my heart obviously is left, but I'm wondering what happened in our continent. If you look at the list of presidents that were revolutionaries in the 60s, that could deliver only very, very mild reforms. I'm thinking Lula back, like Fernando Enrique Cardoso, the leader of the dependency theory. Of course, Pepe Mujica, who is a beloved figure for all of us that got to know him at that time. Pepe, of course, did a beautiful political style of leadership, but he couldn't do important structural changes either. So I'm saying that I think one of the questions that were articulated here, number 4, I believe, present the question of whether the structural phenomena created by globalization tied the hands of people who otherwise have genuinely the intention of going about carrying out changes. Michelle Bachelet in my country, she's obviously somebody that has a trajectory in the left. She cannot lead the government with the lowest rate of approval. There is a crisis of political representation in Chile and in many countries in Latin America where people are profoundly disenchanted with leaders. So these are things that I'm sure will emerge here. And finally, let's not forget that Fidel died, and that's a big event for sure. And we have Donald Trump.
Well, let's get, that's an important way to end the conversation. I think this is going to be a fascinating conversation going forward. Let's take a couple of minutes.
Max, Leslie, Alejandro.
Max, Leslie, and Alejandro
occupy these seats.
And if people, we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Sorry?
I have a stand, we have, so I have to stand up there.
Okay,
We can do it, I guess so, yeah.
Okay.
It's,
This is
Good to see you. Thank you. It's nice to see this is your house.
Yes, all of us still.
Right.
I pointed out, and he said, oh, that's You can stand up.
La verità
I know, isn't it wonderful when you can provide technical support?
So how are you doing? Good to see you.
Okay, you too.
Yeah. I feel this slight pang of guilt every time I think about you because I haven't got subscribed to Tanakla. But part of the reason is there used to be a Canadian distributor. And so I need to figure out a way that I get it here without paying US dollars.
Yeah.
Do you guys do you know whether there is a Canadian?
That's a great
question. What do Canadians do to get subscribe to? Otherwise, I wind up having to make that payment in US dollars.
No, that makes sense.
And then there's the postage, right? Is different too. But
Yeah,
I suppose because I've been getting all of these requests to resubscribe, which I want to do.
Sorry.
And I've been meaning to do it, but
I apologize for the insistence.
No, on the contrary. It's actually welcome. I need to be reminded, and it's something I definitely want to do. Yeah.
So how are we going to do this? Now I'm supposed to chair. Are we sitting the panel together, or we just do it informally?
Creo que no, pero él iba con los libros, ¿no? Y creo que te estamos poniendo un dato en Twitter también, ¿no? Y con Patrick.
So my role is humble. I just have to control this. I can do it from anywhere.
Más o menos, sí. Por un segundo capítulo.
Yeah, I think there's
Estoy ahora solicitando con un trabajo también, aunque tengo garantizado un año. Pero vivo en Filadelfia, así que espero que salga algo por el área.
Más o menos lo que está. Más o menos trata sobre el tema que vas a presentar.
No, esto lo que voy a presentar es como parte de un ensayo largo que estoy trabajando sobre la competencia entre la teoría de la economía y la propuesta del comunitarismo norteamericano. Y también de una especie de dossier que edité a comienzo de este año sobre esta cuestión del fin de ciclo explorativo. La tesis son sobre distintos momentos de crisis del Estado en América Latina, pero en literatura, ¿no? Porque no soy un departamento de
Con Javier, claro. Sí, sí, está en el comité. Javier, Gabriel, Gabriela Narcel, también es profesor fuera de Michigan. Chileno. Sí, tengo tu libro, quiero leerlo, lo he montado a tiempo, pero...
Siempre estamos en eso, ¿no?
Sí.
La lista se vuelve mucho más larga.
Sí, sí, hay muchas cosas para leer, la verdad.
Sí, sí, sí. Pero está bien. Entonces estás completamente aparte.
Un poco. Al principio me interesa tanto con los debates de la política del latinoamericanismo, ¿no?
Y los temas que estás tratando en la tesis, ¿cuáles son los cuatro?
Dos casos sobre Paraguay y Argentina en el siglo XIX y después la Revolución Cubana y la Unidad Popular en Chile.
La Revolución Cubana, pero que
en los primeros momentos me interesa como pensar los distintos casos, sobre todo en comunidades afro-cubanas, que no de alguna manera resistieron, pero que sí encontraron una especie de éxodo a la no integración del nuevo Estado, ¿no? Y fueron condenados por pereza, por vago, por improductivo, ¿no? Entonces hay una serie como de testimonios, cine, ¿no? Por el trabajo un poco de Oscar Lewis, ¿no? De historia oral, como que encaja ahí, aunque no lo trato, ¿no? Pero es como el fondo de ese barrio de las Yaguas, ¿no?
como argumento general, ya lo que te ves.
Lo tengo desarrollado a un nivel conceptual, ¿no? Pero creo que tengo que afinar un poco más, ¿no? Sería como las fisuras de, es lo que llamo como fisuras de momentos de unidad soberana, ¿no? Visto desde arriba, desde el poder constituido, o desde abajo, ¿no? De momentos de lo nacional popular.
Claro, que difícil porque cuando se
que también, exacto.
Incluso a nivel de país.
Exactamente.
Estamos, bueno, yo hablar sobre Venezuela, que obviamente lo que se pregunta allá son
Sí, cae en una especie de fidelidad absoluta, ¿no?
Okay, so folks, we're gonna get started with the first panel. Okay, we're gonna get started to if folks should
sí, de
presentaron allá en Prisa, ¿no?
if everyone can just take their seats.
Seguimos hablando ahí.
Yeah, if everyone can just take their seats, we'd be grateful.
But 20, 15 minutes to present and 5 minutes to question, 15 minutes to discussion, or do we split the 20 minutes in 2 rounds? What do you prefer?
I would think the presentation that I want to and have this all.
All right.
So 20 minutes for each now,
Probably
and then
not,
discussion at the end.
Feels that way.
Clarifying questions.
Yeah, the danger, I would keep the questions necessary. The risk.
Otherwise, it's just balloons.
Well, my role in this conference is humble. I just have to make sure that the speakers in this panel behave. And the plan is to assign for each of the speakers, to Max and Leslie and Alejandro, a max of 20 minutes in a round of presentations, one round. And then we have 50 minutes left for questions and discussions of their, I'm not sure how we're going to handle the process of receiving the questions and the comments, but let's allow for some degree of spontaneity and flexibility about it. Yeah. So,
and we have discussants who haven't had the privilege of reading the papers in advance,
right?
But they will kick off the discussion.
Osmosis.
all right, so I'm assuming that I have the correct order here. Max would be presenting on cycles of political change in Latin America.
All right, thank you very much, Alejandro. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pass out a set of handouts, and then I'm going to use for the presentation. I think there's almost enough for everyone in the room. If not, I've got a few sort of extra tables, which I guess that I can circulate as well. Yeah, why don't I just pass it? This is a summary of a lot of material. This actually kind of summarizes what I cover in an entire course. It usually takes me about 39 hours to get through this, and I'm going to try to get through it in 20 minutes. But I wanted to give you, and I apologize for presenting what is really very much a work in progress, but I just want to put some stuff on the table, and then we can kind of have a discussion of it. In brief, I want to argue that in the left turns in Latin America were never a critical juncture, that in fact they're part of the sequence of reactions and counter-reactions to the more fundamental shift, which is neoliberalism. So that sort of supports a little bit what Alejandro was saying just a minute ago. Secondly, I want to say that if we sort of think comparatively about countries in the region and sorting them, particularly in relation to the kinds of conditions that would be conducive to the development of high-quality democratic institutions and shared prosperity, development, the sorting looks very similar to what we would have observed in the 19th century. So there are remarkable continuities in terms of the rankings of countries in terms of performance along a range of dimensions. And the third point that I want to stress is that we can observe quite distinctive patterns of trajectories of institutional development in the region. I'm going to call them sort of roughly pattern 1 and pattern 2, that's very prosaic, but I want to suggest that what these patterns tend toward is an outcome in which we really observe a set of cases in which as Eric was saying, shifts to the left are part of the kind of normal alternation in power. A set of cases where shifts to the left have coincided with crises of domination, and consequently those shifts have been potentially more consequential. And a set of cases where the experience of repression and mass violence has been such that shifts to the left have been impossible. So let me just sort of run through this. The first thing I want to say is if you could just sort of look at the PowerPoint slides. There's a sort of a table that's described as the stylized facts. What I'd like to argue is that we can think of Latin America's history as being broken down fundamentally into 3 major stages. The first is the period of the initial insertion of Latin America into the global economic system, the construction of agro-export economies, and around that, the development of oligarchic states. The second is the breakdown of oligarchic states, the rise of populism, and a period from roughly the 1930s through the 1960s in which import substituting industrialization is pursued, developmental states are constructed, and this period enters into crisis in the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1980s, we have a third major shift, which is the shift to neoliberalism, and from roughly 1982, Mexican default to the present time. This is, I would characterize as a single period of neoliberalism within which the shifts to the left are a reaction to that process. So furthermore, I think if we look at the countries of the region, we can observe, broadly speaking, 2 quite distinctive modal patterns. The first pattern, which I've called sort of prosaically sort of pattern 1, are countries that experienced a long period of anarchy immediately after independence and had difficulty constructing oligarchic states. There were deep cleavages between elites, often between liberals and conservatives, and what resulted from that were more or less repressive oligarchies. These oligarchies were challenged by more radical forms of populism with the emergence of the social question. So the first major critical juncture is independence. The second critical juncture is the 1930s and the emergence of the social question. That's the moment of the incorporation of labor, to use the Collier's framework. And then we see over the subsequent decades the development of in many countries of the model of import subsidy industrialization, the development of corporatist states. The popular sector is incorporated often directly through state institutions in the form of corporatism or through parties, either clientelistic parties or populist mass-based political parties. And that process works itself out. The effect of that process of particularly where the mobilization is more radical tends to generate a more authoritarian response toward the end of that period. We see the rise of bureaucratic authoritarian regimes in the more industrially advanced countries of the region. Then there's the moment of redemocratization, which more or less coincides with neoliberalism. And in these countries, we tend to observe more radical shifts to the left. The second pattern is quite distinctive. It's a smaller number of countries that fit this pattern, but they have a briefer period of anarchy, the construction of more constitutional oligarchies that are better at accommodating emerging interests with the rise of the social question, and consequently you have a much more attenuated experience of mobilization and response that tends to produce milder forms of authoritarianism in the 1970s and subsequently higher quality democracy in the period of redemocratization. Now, to explain these patterns, I just point to the sort of the structural, the table which gives you the structural conditions in the region. And what you've got there are countries that are sorted from those countries that were central to the colonial enterprise, countries with large indigenous populations, countries where labor repressive agriculture was practiced, in other words, large haciendas or plantations, where extractivism was important, and where, not surprisingly, you tend to see higher levels of mass violence and repression. Well, I've sorted them from that down to the cases that were more marginal, peripheral to the colonial enterprise. Smaller, more homogeneous countries tended to be on the periphery of the region. Countries where labor repressive agriculture was either not practiced, as in Costa Rica, or was, as in Chile, but with less repression, and and less reliance on extraction of mineral resources, so much less likely to produce a more rent-seeking kind of state. And it's in that context that you get milder versions of populism and more easily accommodated within existing institutions. These are the countries that today have both the highest levels of human development, but they also have the highest quality of democracy. So you can sort of look there and see the different cases. Now, a critical point that I want to make here is that a fundamental question that we have to ask ourselves at the beginning of this sort of contemporary Latin American politics is around the construction of an underlying pact of domination. My argument is where there is not a stable pact of domination, it's very difficult either to achieve any form of capitalist development or democracy. Whereas as a more or less stable pact of domination is formed, then the critical question becomes what's the character of the underlying social relationships and whether they're conducive or not to a process of more inclusive development and of democratization. One of the things that strikes me as really distinctive and really important about Latin America that's relevant to Latin America's left turns is the importance of what O'Donnell called lo popular as a mediation. So we can think about mediations as being things like citizenship or nation, which are reasons given to justify a system of domination that go beyond the interests of whoever currently occupies power. The popular sectors, Latin America is the only region in the world where people talk about the popular sectors and where that's a meaningful referendum. Why is that the case? I think it's the case fundamentally because populism emerges in response to the oligarchic state. The oligarchic states were essentially states that excluded everyone but the narrow, typically agro-exporting elite. And so the construction of this idea of the people as an excluded collective identity is something that's very important in the Latin American context and which I think reemerges in the context of Latin America's left turns. Yeah, thanks. So if I could get you just to go forward then and look at the sort of very end of the PowerPoint slides. What I want to suggest is that if we look at Latin America in the context of the neoliberal era, in some ways, and this goes back to the point that Schrank and Luna and Murillo were making, in some ways, the region resembles the Latin America in the 19th century, in the sense that it still is important to, in terms of the sorting of the cases. We observe sort of, I would say, three major patterns. So the first set of countries would be Guatemala, Colombia, Mexico, Peru. Now, what I think is really striking about this is the four major cases in which we don't see a left turn in Latin America are precisely the countries that were most critical in the colonial period, right? It's exactly in Mexico, which was, of course, a viceroyalty, Guatemala City, Bogota, and Lima. These were major centers of colonial domination. It's in precisely those countries, which, of course, they were important centers precisely because they had substantial natural resources and they had large indigenous populations that were available to use for labor. It's in that context, in those countries, that we see no shift to the left. And I think that the reason for that, and again, if you look through each of the cases, what you see in these cases, in these countries, is high levels of repression, of periods, of episodes of mass violence and repression. So take the case of Colombia. From the end of the 19th century, with the War of 1,000 Days, to the La Violencia, to the violence against the FARC, with the FARC and the drug trafficking, waves of extraordinary levels of violence. Similarly, we see the case of Peru, Shining Path, Guatemala, the repression that follows the closing down of the period of democratic reform in the 1950s. 1940s and 1950s. It's in those countries. So today you wouldn't look for. I mean, there are examples of sort of labor repressive agriculture, but I think that fundamentally what we're seeing here is the legacies of violence that come from the structural conditions of those cases is what produces the efforts at political change through armed struggle that make it hard for there to be, in the current context of redemocratization, projects of the left within the context of a democratic institutions. The other two sets of cases that we see here, Uruguay, Costa Rica, and Chile, and there are some important qualifications to be made around Chile there, but these are countries that historically have been marginal to the colonial enterprise, the more homogeneous, smaller countries where you don't get the same sort of intensity of repression in the countryside. And it's in those contexts, and of course, Chile, I think, is an interesting case because in some ways it exemplifies the second pattern, but it goes off the rails in 1973 with the coup and the extraordinarily high level of mass repression. I think what we see in Chile today is an attempt to sort of return to the kind of trajectory that Costa Rica and Uruguay have tended to sustain. The other set of cases then are those countries where we see the left emerging often in the context of crises of domination. So countries like Argentina and Brazil Argentina and Bolivia had much greater difficulty in creating enduring pacts of domination, very weak entrepreneurial elites. And hence, when the left emerges, it's often in the context of a serious crisis of domination, which I think makes it more likely that the left will tend to look more radical. Brazil is an interesting case, which I think is a little bit difficult to locate in some respects, because on the one hand, it exemplifies the first pattern that I described earlier, but it has a long tradition of gradualism, whether it's not going through a period of anarchy, or rather monarchy in the 19th century, and then throughout the abolition of slavery happened in a much more sort of gradual and nonviolent way. We do see kind of the construction of an oligarchic state, and it certainly is repressive with coronelismo. But we also see a milder form, of highly corporatist form of inclusion under Vargas, of populism under Goulart, producing bureaucratic authoritarianism, but in the context in which the left is actually quite weak and the guerrilla threat was quite limited, and so much less repressive form of military rule, one that actually persisted in the strategy of ISI much later than many of the other cases. And so today, I think Brazil, continues to be a country in which we see alternation in power, but I'm not sure that what we would observe in Brazil today, although I'd throw that open as a sort of a question for discussion, is whether there is in fact a crisis of domination occurring in Brazil. So the sort of overall thrust of the argument that I think I want to kind of conclude with is the following: that there are, if we look at the region, sort of 2 or 3 kind of major different trajectories of institutional development. That one pattern, which is less common, is a pattern that involves a process of construction of citizenship, a process that's more inclusive, a process that involves accommodating a broader spectrum of interests, investing earlier and more substantially in the construction of citizenship through investments in healthcare and education and so forth. You see that in the second pattern of countries. That those are the countries that today offer the best prospect for sustained democratization and for inclusive development. But I think what we are seeing in a number of the other cases, so to go back to the point about Bolivia, to go back to the point about Brazil, I don't think what we're seeing in the contemporary period is another effort at incorporation. I don't think that's the best way to frame the discussion. I think instead what we're seeing is an effort through the promotion of participatory mechanisms of popular participation, an attempt to lay the foundation for inclusion, not through incorporation or through corporatism, not even necessarily through populist parties, but incorporation through mechanisms of participation that provide a potential foundation for citizenship, right? So this is not a moment of a new incorporation of the construction of corporatism. It's an attempt to build the basis of citizenship that could provide sustainable democracy and more inclusive patterns of development. And so the countries that I'm most concerned about in the region today would actually be the countries that have not experienced left turns, because it is in the places where repression has been used to prevent efforts at reform and inclusion that in fact are exactly the countries that we see the greatest challenges in terms of the construction of citizenship. And they are, of course, the exact same countries that presented those same challenges earlier in the 19th century.
Well, thank you so much, Max. Highly disciplined, respect for the time constraints.
I'm sorry.
Especially to cover such an enormously wide territory. So thank you very much. So I have Leslie, Elliott, Armijo.
Yeah. I need to talk from here despite the request to speak to the tape because I've been PowerPoint. And I have just misplaced the holder. Now, I just misplaced my purse and therefore my phone, and therefore would like someone to give me a halfway, 10 minutes or 5 minutes, please. So, good. I'm also a PC user, so not a Mac user. Anyone help?
Double click.
I'm done.
Let's go.
There we go. And where is
I don't
Armijo, bottom left.
Us.
Is the lighter, bottom
Yeah,
left.
it's in a different place.
Right there.
Oh, it's here. Yes. Okay, so, delighted to be here at 7. I have to admit though that Max's eyes must have been better than mine. We went to grad school together, but I didn't read the first of your PowerPoints. Take my glass. Anyway, when I looked at the program, I said, okay, I'm not a live economist on here, I'm a political economist. So I decided to ask some really basic, factual, pragmatic, not terribly theoretical, but let's get some information out there kinds of questions. So I did some data mining. And I asked the question, what has been the result of the left in power, particularly in the 3 big countries, Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela? I'm a big country person anyway, but I don't think that the results that I'm going to show you would be different if we had included smaller countries. But it's easier to see if we put big countries. So I did the Latin American second, and I assumed then that we have Argentina, Brazil, and Venezuela are more or less left since more or less 2000, and that Chile, Colombia, Mexico, and Peru are more or less right or center right. So, I don't know the next slide.
Hit the cursor. Nice. The cursor just down.
Oh, I see. Yep, all right, good. So why do we care? Why do we care about left governments and left turns? I think ultimately our predisposition for left governments in Latin America or elsewhere in the world rests on our fundamental belief that a government that has a leftist ideology or a leftist promise or a leftist program is going to implement left-leaning policies, and it's going to result in fair economic and social outcomes. So essentially what I have done then is investigate the dependent variable that we hopes to be fair economic and social outcomes. And I have assumed that there is such a thing as a left or a right in ideology and in policy, that by left we mean labor, so pro-labor, pro-masses, including rural masses. We mean a concern about employment. We also mean a concern about growth, and we mean especially a concern about redistribution, and we're willing to make some trade-off with lower growth if it comes to that. And that by right, we mean more pro-business. We're thinking about what pleases investors, including foreign investors. We think about savings and investment, growth, low inflation, low public debt, and further to the right you go, the more you're willing perhaps to make a trade-off of lower growth for the sake of stabilization, inflation and growth. Okay, so how does it come out? As I said, I've given, assumed that we have 3 and 4, more or less. And all my presentation is I went to St. Paul, I went to the World Economic Outlook of the IMF, I went to the World Development Indicators, and I went to a couple of other sources. The data I actually show you is mostly a function of what I could easily access. In terms of democracy, which is not exactly an outcome of economic policies, but is something that we're concerned with today, especially when we talk about institutionalization, this is what I got. Starting the source I use starts in 2006, and I'm hoping that you can see. Are you able to see the countries and the lines? It's big enough. Good. That was my biggest word. So this is pretty much what you expect. Chile comes out the most democratic, Venezuela the least. Not a huge amount of change over time. I purposefully did not use Heritage Foundation or Freedom House because people might see them as ideologically taken. I purposely used the Economist Intelligence Unit, which I thought was actually reasonably fair. You know, the Economist, I think is very good on things like human rights. And so,
Sorry, Leslie, could you just give us the rank from top to bottom? I can't quite see, but so what are the most and what are the least? Okay.
So the gray on the top is Chile.
Okay.
The orange is Brazil. And then the two blues there that are close together are Argentina and Mexico. Argentina is the light blue. The yellow is Colombia. The green is Peru, and the dark blue is Venezuela. And those colors are the same throughout.
Okay, can I ask what's being measured?
Yeah, there are four or five categories. One is free and fair elections. One is political institutions. One is what they call political participation. One is political culture, and that's interesting. And I dug into that because Latin America gets really low scores, even in Brazil and Chile, and that's sort of how much do you believe, what's your normative attachment to democracy? It's pretty low. People are quite skeptical. But nonetheless, countries like all of these get fairly high scores. But I mean, the truth is, Uruguay gets a higher score than the US. Canada gets a higher score than the US. And the scores of this sort of 7.5 to 8 range is equivalent to what they give Japan and South Korea and France. And Italy has a lower score. Italy is down around where, Mexico is. So I found it more credible than some other rankings. All right, so I'm going to start with a bunch of indicators of inequality and poverty, because clearly our biggest hope in terms of policy and in terms of outcomes is you see some improvement. I'm a Brazilianist, by the way, for those who don't know me, and the big story about Brazil is, gee, we can finally started to come down. Brazil used to be one of the worst in the world. It's still high, but it's improved a lot. So here's the evidence. This is the Gini index, and it goes from 0 to 1 or to 100. This is in percent. So the lower you are, the worse it is. The higher you are, the better. I'm just going to stand here maybe. So this is Brazil. Brazil.
Yeah.
Yes, so, no. The lower you are, the better. Isn't that what you're saying? No. So this is good, this is bad. Okay, thank you for, so, Brazil, you see quite a bit of improvement. This is Argentina. The ones where they're not connected means there's missing data. It's a little harder to see the missing data ones. Argentina goes up and then down. But it actually ends not too different from where it started. Yellow, Colombia goes way up and then comes down. It's pretty much a wash. In fact, it's higher at the end than in the early 90s. The biggest improvements are in Brazil, Peru, the green, and Chile you can't see because for whatever reason the Chilean statisticians only collect half as often as the other people, and so it's harder to see it's the gray, but it also goes down quite a bit. So on this one, it seems like the biggest improvements would have been in Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Here's another way of thinking about the kind of outcomes we would like to have seen. This is the poverty less than $3 a day. So the big dramatic one here is Mexico, Argentina. Yeah, it goes way up with the crisis and then it comes down, but ends up pretty much where it started. Again, Brazil, the orange, you see a big improvement. Colombia is kind of goes way up and then comes down. This one you want less again. Chile is a moderate down. Again, they don't collect statistics the way the others do, so it's hard to see, but the trend is down. And Peru is, the trend is down. So it's pretty much the same three countries. Here's another way of thinking about it. Life expectancy at birth. Everybody improves. The steepest slopes would be Chile, Peru, and Brazil, again, and less steep slopes than the others. I was surprised. I didn't know I was going to find this. I just said, well, let me see what comes out. And you get similar results from other kinds of data. I looked at access to clean water and things like that. It tends to come out the same way. And then I looked at the sort of economic outcomes that sort of the business is going to care about, and or that everybody's going to care about. My sort of middle ones are growth. So growth, you find some of the stuff. Clearly, there are regional shocks going on, there's a downfall associated with the Asian financial crisis here. I started in 1990 because there was missing data. Everybody goes up, everybody goes down, but mainly Argentina and Venezuela in the early 2000s. It's basically them. I guess everybody else is pretty much the same. And then Venezuela is the most erratic by far. This is Venezuela's the dark. And I get annoyed with people like news analysts and people who look at the last 2 or 3 years and sort of say, oh, Brazil's a disaster or whatever countries it is. That you need a longer time frame. It seems to me that on the whole, the story is one of stabilizing growth. This is the recent global financial crisis, from which, by the way, Latin America recovered relatively well. I just wrote a book about that. Asia and Latin America recovered well. Both the major countries recovered, of course, faster than many advanced industrial countries, particularly with Western. How am I doing on time? Somebody's supposed to be.
You still have 7 minutes.
Okay, great, wonderful. Investment, some do better than others. Latin America invests less than Asia, and it's always a perennial concern. I was interested to see again how erratic Venezuela is. I'm not quite sure what that's measuring. It may simply mean, this is just spending on, Petroquisa, I don't know. But not a lot of difference among the countries there. And certainly not, you are not seeing less investment in the left countries by any means. And that, of course, investment and industrialization has been important for Argentina, Brazil, including under left governments.
That presumably includes Chinese investment?
Yeah. I think that's what's going on in Venezuela. This is actual investment in the country. It doesn't say where they're getting the money from.
That can also explain why the left doesn't lead to less investment, which is place.
Yes. Well, yes, and it depends, but it also depends on what they're using it for. If you just use it for redistribution, then you're not going to get investment. So the takeaway from this is probably that no, the left is not just using it for redistribution, at least in these countries. Inflation, again, pretty much everybody has managed to get a handle on this, except for Venezuela. And this series starts in 1995. This is just after real in Brazil, so it's still coming down. In fact, I had a longer series, but I couldn't put it, you couldn't see anything if I put the first part on, so I started in 1995. All right, I could have put up more, but here's where I come out. And these are very much interim observations. We value the left, I think, for its promise of left parties who presumably have the interests of the masses at heart. Citizens are interested less in ideas, most of them, than in economic and social outcomes. And it seems to me that this has been brought home to all of us. I mean, how else do we avoid right populism? As in below the border. To my surprise, it's not that clear from an examination of the 7 largest countries that those more or less on the left achieved outcomes, at least since 2000, that were better or different than those on the right or center right, at least in this sample of 7 big countries, even in the inequality poverty distribution outcomes. I'm not quite sure why, but I thought this was a place to start. As I showed you in some of the slides, I think the best performers in terms of redistribution outcomes in this period appear to be Brazil, Chile, and Peru. And the worst performer in both growth, not so much levels, but volatility, which is very hard for people to live with. And in several of the redistribution measures, which you may not have noticed, but Venezuela just stops reporting about halfway through on a number of those. There's a crash, and then there's no more data. Appears to be Venezuela. Okay, that's what happens. And now I need help closing this, please. Excellent show. There we go. Yep, good. I'm learning. I need
Okay, so we're going to have now the presentation by Alejandro Velasco, Oil, Socialism, and Revolution in Venezuela and Reckoning.
Great. Well, thanks so much for the invitation to participate. I'm delighted to be here. I should also say I would be remiss if, as executive editor of NACLA Report on the Americas, if I didn't invite you to see some of our latest issues, including our latest one published this week, which is about the return of the right. But all this year, our foci have been some of the questions that we're addressing here. And so you might find some of those debates of interest, and that's at nacla.org. Okay, so I recently returned from 6 weeks in Caracas, and let me just say from the outset that it wasn't as bad as I imagined. It was worse. But importantly, not in the way that I expected. Over the last 6 months in international media, we've read and seen and heard increasingly dystopian coverage that might rival anything coming out of Aleppo or Sudan or the Mediterranean. Stories of starving Venezuelans rummaging through trash or getting by on mangoes, fleeing to the tune of tens of thousands a day by raft to Curaçao, over land to Colombia, on planes to anywhere they can, fending with outbreaks of once eradicated diseases like malaria, diphtheria, locked in their homes at all times, but especially after nightfall, lest violent crime claim their lives with ever-increasing death tolls. One analyst recently, for instance, stated that Venezuela's current crisis is the worst in all of Latin America in the last 35 years. That's in all of Latin America since 1981. No worse crisis. So as an historian of Latin America, these kinds of statements immediately raise my suspicion, less because they are impossible or even untrue, than because Venezuela has been the playground of breathless maximalism for close to 2 decades now, whether via inflated claims of utopian socialism or incessant warnings of a Hitlerian lurch. So the sky is perpetually at hand or perpetually falling, and the proverbial wolf is constantly being called. Well, the wolf is at hand, and it is fierce. What it looks like, though, is different from what we read in most of the coverage. To be sure, I saw plenty of trash rummaging, though not especially different from what I've seen elsewhere in the US or certainly at other times in Venezuela during or before the Chavez era. I spoke with several friends and acquaintances, young and old, in the process of leaving Venezuela. But insofar as there's been a spike in migration, it is more of a function of the recent opening of the Colombian border, coupled, of course, with the worsening crisis, which I'll say more about in a moment. I also did a lot of walking and took public transportation, metro and bus throughout the city without incident in the daytime and nighttime. I saw construction crews and cranes putting up strikingly opulent and cutting-edge residential and commercial properties throughout Caracas. I saw packed restaurants and grocery stores, even in malls, and even Canadian furs selling like hotcakes, which was only slightly more disorienting than the multi-day yoga fest that stretched well past sunset at a major public plaza in the eastern Caracas. None of which is to minimize the crisis. By any means and measures, it is severe. The worst is, as we just saw, the inflation, as the government holds on to a thoroughly discredited currency control system for little more reason at this point than to feed the corruption that keeps its inner core afloat. It has basically moved increasingly to dollarize more and more parts of the economy, both formally and informally. So last year it was the real estate and auto sales sectors. Now it's extended to most food items as well, which are imported as Venezuela's historic dependence on foreign products has deepened over the last decade plus. As I saw, for instance, in the company of a friend who worked security at a government warehouse in Western Caracas, the Western Caracas area of Katia, even putatively subsidized products are being sold at black market rates from government stores. And because most distribution is controlled by the military, as Maduro has formally appointed generals to take the fight against what he calls economic war, distribution is almost completely unaccountable and therefore highly susceptible to corruption from petty to large scale. So it was that I saw, for instance, food from those West Caracas warehouses meant for selling at already inflated prices to West Caracas residents, diverted and escorted by military personnel to upscale Caracas restaurants in the eastern part of the city to be sold at even more inflated prices. And on top of the increasing unaffordability of products, which has created what David Smiley, Venezuelan analyst, has called the classic model not of socialist but of neoliberal shortages, there's also the shortage of cash, as it takes, or at least took a couple weeks ago when I was last there, 10 of the highest note bill, 100 bolivares, although they just announced higher denominations about to be unrolled, to buy a cup of coffee. And ATMs could only dispense as much as 6,000 to 8,000 a day. So the spectacle of long lines at ATMs has replaced the spectacle of long lines at stores as a paradoxical feature of economic crisis. This is just one area, but there are many others. Basic infrastructure is shot. So, few street lamps work at night, such that the city feels darker at night. Broken sidewalks, burnout streetlights, open manholes on highways. While food is available at inflated prices, medicines are definitely scarce, as the dollars to purchase them are also scarce, creating the strange picture of pharmacies forced to stay afloat by stocking as many supplies of candy, soda, and snacks as they do of pills, sort of like CVS and Walgreens on steroids, no pun intended. Most of all, though, it was what I heard that was disconcerting. Anger and frustration at the government, especially from bulwark areas of radical leftism, like the 23 de Enero neighborhood in the western part of Caracas, which is where I do most of my historical and ethnographic research, is far from new. I recounted examples and traced their roots in my book, Barrio Rising. As recently as last year when I was there, what was new was the urgency of the rage that I heard from friends and respondents, in Venezuelan parlance, arrechera, that's what we call it, especially at government corruption, incompetence, and indecision, and directed most particularly, again, at the military. This time, however, underlying that rage was something else, something even more paralyzing, and this was what was striking to me: demoralization. This demoralization extended broadly, generally, held up by a thin thread of daily routines and occasional diversions. So Venezuela's crisis is as bad as it is because its most troubling feature extends far deeper than meets the eye, whether it's a newscast or on page one. It's a crisis simultaneously of social inertia and political paralysis. So with this in mind, I want to make 3 points. Hopefully, at the time, I'll draw them out as much as I can. So the first draws on two experiences that I had while in Caracas in October and November. They reveal, I think, the true depth of the crisis, which goes far beyond what which journalists with a great eye for headline but poor eye for analysis can muster. The second considers the why of this particular crisis, offering what I hope is a more grounded, honest appraisal of Venezuela's Bolivarian revolution than we're used to. The third draws on this appraisal to consider what it meant for the left, or what it means for the left going forward, how it can respond in Venezuela and elsewhere, certainly in the United States, at a moment of retreat. So let me just start with these two vignettes. So the first one was on October 27th, which, if you weren't following the news, was the so-called Toma de Venezuela. It was a major protest staged by the opposition to protest what, of course, had been the decision to not go forward with the recall referendum, which had just come down the week before. It was billed as a follow-up to the 1st of September Toma de Caracas, which, by all accounts, was among the largest demonstrations in Venezuela, bringing together what was a far more diverse crowd than the opposition can usually muster, both in terms of race and class. By contrast, the October 27th protest was much smaller, but when I went to it, and I went near one of the stages, the main stages where political leaders of the opposition were supposed to be speaking, what really caught me off guard was the kind of energy that one detects from these demonstrations, and I've been to many in the course of doing my work and also being from Venezuela. In one particular moment caught me entirely by surprise. Henry Ramos Alup, who is now the president of the National Assembly, which was, of course, won by the opposition in the last December's election by an overwhelming majority, who in turn is from the party Acción Democrática, which was the primary party during the Punto Fijo years that Chavismo ostensibly replaced. He, of course, has now emerged as one of the major figures of the opposition leadership, which to me was entirely surprising, and I hadn't quite captured the depths to which this was true until I was here. There were speakers on stage talking about, how we need to get rid of the government, get rid of Maduro, et cetera, but people were basically just milling about having conversations until Henry spoke. Henry, so we call him. And then there was sort of a quiet in the entire crowd, which took up basically the major highway of Venezuela, Francisco Fajardo. People literally saying, shh, Henry is speaking, Henry va a hablar. Again, as somebody who has studied the breakdown and collapse of Punto Fijo, the Punto Fijo Pact that Acción Democrática was so central to, the idea that an Acción Democrática, an ADECO, would now command the attention, literally, of people who had voted them out significantly in 1998 by not aligning with Acción Democrática was dramatic, to say the least. But what was more dramatic was that after he spoke for basically 5 minutes, that's it, saying that we're going to enter negotiations and dialogue with the government, people were left entirely bereft. They weren't quite sure what to do next. Later, it was revealed that the conversation that happened that gave rise to 4 strategies that the opposition would subsequently take. One was going into dialogue with the opposition, with the government. Another one was to stage a protest to Miraflores presidential palace, which would have been the first since the coup of 2002, which you've written so well about. An impeachment of Maduro in Congress, and a recall referendum, to push for a recall referendum. That all was happening backstage in a debate that they were having in the moment of this demonstration, right? What that illustrated, of course, was how little the opposition has learned over the last 17 years in terms of political strategy, in terms of capitalizing on moments of opportunity, and also significantly in terms of drawing upon what is certainly this moment of severe crisis to expand its breadth and reach. So that's the first vignette. The second one is, I'm going to change his name here to Robert, although it's just because of what I'm going to say. He's a longtime activist in his 23 Enero neighborhood. One of these people who imagines themselves and calls themselves, and certainly has lived the life of a revolutionary before Chavez came to power, and so therefore provides him with some significant credibility to be able to criticize the government, as he long has, either for being too accommodationist or for being not revolutionary enough, especially vis-a-vis the opposition. from time to time, when I speak with him, he offers me his analysis in the context of the coyuntura. And this time, he said something that completely caught me off guard. He said, "Al pueblo no puede dársele poder así por así." You can't give the people power just like that. You need institutions. Now, this is somebody who has long railed against institutionalism, per se, not necessarily against institutions. This is somebody who has long advocated for participatory mechanisms of governance, who's at the forefront of leading communal councils in his neighborhood, a commune as well. So for him to be saying this reflected something far deeper about what he imagines as some of the failures of bringing about a process that he very much imagined could really transform Venezuela. Just after, when I asked him, well, so where does that leave you? Does that leave you that supporting the opposition? He says, all they do is cry crocodile tears. And so what this was in reference to stories that I just mentioned about, trash rummaging and exiles and all the rest of it, all of which for him is a clear strategy to discredit Venezuela, not at all to proclaim any kind of empathy. He says, I die before letting the opposition take power. Okay, so what to do with these vignettes? Possible readings. As I mentioned in the first case, the opposition has learned nothing, which is important to think about what comes next, not only in Venezuela, but also in places like Argentina and elsewhere. And because it hasn't learned anything, it can't reach out to sectors, as I mentioned before, that could potentially allow for a different vision of a future Venezuela. It therefore undermines its credibility with its own supporters precisely at a moment when it should be strongest, in the process demoralizing them further. Now that goes double for the left, for left grassroots activists like Robert. They feel abandoned by the government. Right? That's the source of this dismay. And they can't at the same time contemplate supporting the opposition. So you have these two sides of the same coin of demoralization. And like much else in Venezuela, the underlying dynamic at play here rings familiar. And it speaks to deeper features of political life and culture in Venezuela that may help us to explain this moment better beyond emerging standard interpretations. So I'm going to turn to what these interpretations are and how they chafe at what I just described. There are two increasingly popular explanations for Venezuela's current crisis, and both I've asserted elsewhere are dangerously wrong. The first one blames oil as the source both of the country's riches and its misery. It's a sort of classic story of the petrostate. And there are technical terms for it, Dutch disease, resource curse. But at root, the logic is simple enough. Countries whose economies depend on a single commodity, prone to wild price fluctuations, as is oil, this speaks to your volatility models, are notoriously poor at long-term planning. I mean, if you had taken that series back to the 1970s, I suspect you'd have found something very, very similar, speaking about historical memory. When oil prices soar, dollars are plentiful, not just because of windfall revenues, but also because wealth makes it easy to acquire debt. That also, I think, explains the big dip, big rise at the end there, because China lent Venezuela $50 billion over the last 2 years. Right? So that countries spend both what they have and what they anticipate having. So in turn, easy access to dollars means it's more profitable in the short term to buy imported products and to invest in local industry, especially when domestic markets are small and expected returns minor. When oil prices fall, often as abruptly as they rose, the cash needed to maintain high import levels dries up, and having failed to invest in domestic industry, goods grow scarce and more expensive. Meanwhile, debt that was contracted in times of plenty mean major loan payments, which governments finance by depressing the value of local currency in order to shore up dollars, in the process making local money worth less and less and driving up inflation more and more. It's just pretty classic, standard, and we've seen it in Venezuela before. It's a sordid tale, and we saw it in the 50s with military dictatorship of Pérez Jiménez. We saw it in the 1970s after the Mideast oil embargo shot prices of oil to historic highs, and Venezuela embarked on a spending and debt spree even more spectacular than the one before, raising quality of life and making Venezuela the envy of the region. But of course, when oil prices collapsed, as they did in the early 1980s, two decades of rising inequality, political turmoil, and social unrest followed before Venezuelans in 1999 elected Hugo Chavez on a promise to make government more responsive to the needs of those left out of the oil pie. And he did when crude prices rose again in the early 2000s, implementing massive public spending and social programs that he later dubbed socialism of the 21st century. And as before, when oil prices plummeted in 2014, so did the gains of the boom years. Again, a pretty standard story. Now, the governments of Venezuela, different stripes, dictatorship, two-party democracy, an incipient socialist government have succumbed to the highs and lows of oil, makes a petrostate explanation compelling. It also suggests a structural problem that goes beyond who is in power or how. But what it doesn't explain is why the scale and scope of the current crisis is decidedly more severe than during previous moments. This in turn has led to point to different culprits, some people to point to different culprits, socialism. Yes, the governments before have squandered revenue windfalls, but today's dire and deteriorating situation cannot be pinned on a resource curse. Instead, blame lies with Chavez's ideological program, which increased state control over the economy, expropriated private property, imposed high taxes on regulations on business, nationalized industry, massively expanded social welfare, ballooned the size of government, and concentrated power in the state, all while chasing away investors, right? It's sort of the economist's worst nightmare. And in fact, troubling signs of economic weakness had already begun to manifest prior to the 2014 collapse of oil prices, indicating that something other than a commodity boom and bust cycle was at play. But of course, pointing to socialism ignores that Chavez didn't suggest, much less implement such a turn until 2005, 7 years after he took office. And he didn't set out to implement it tentatively at that until 2006. Instead, for several years prior, Venezuela's government undertook a series of measures that would eventually set its economy on a familiar path to volatility and crisis. So in 2003, and this really is the date, in 2003, when I think many things changed in Venezuela. Chavez won control over the oil industry after a disastrous month-long oil strike that pit company managers instead of running the company as a private enterprise against the government determined to redirect profits into social spending. Then in 2004, facing dropping popularity rates and a potential recall referendum, Chavez rolled out a series of social programs, the highly popular Misiones, that took advantage of the post-Iraq invasion oil boom. These misiones are, of course, what Chavez wrote from victory to electoral victory through 2013. And as the boom grew, so did spending and debt, mainly on programs aimed at improving health, education, and food access for Venezuela's poor, and in the process lifting millions out of poverty. It was surprising that that statistic was not actually followed through in the slides that you showed earlier. What Chavez's spending didn't do was invest significantly in domestic production, of course, relying instead on imports and immediate assistance that increased consumption levels while leaving much of Venezuela's private sector, from banks to manufacturing, in private hands, hardly a model of socialism. Meanwhile, enormous amounts of money went into artificially keeping Venezuela's currency strong through strict exchange controls imposed in 2003. Again, far from a socialist plot, currency controls were an emergency response to the oil industry strike that left Venezuela in desperate need of cash at that moment. By limiting the amount of dollars individuals and businesses could purchase in the open market, the government could shore up dollars and stem capital flight. And as the immediate crisis abated, the government currency controls did little more than fuel opportunities for corruption, as those whose access to dollars sold them at black market rates. Moreover, the oil boom simultaneously masked and fed corruption as dollars were plentiful. But when dollars became scarce, as prices plummeted, the breach no longer held. So as authorities have stubbornly refused to lift controls, as I mentioned before, not for ideological reasons, but because so many officials are now wrapped up in the web of corruption, black market demand for dollars to finance imports of everything from food to medicine to replacement parts have depressed local currency and driven inflation rates of upwards of 800%. Thank you. I just need a couple more minutes. All of which points to a simple and unexciting reality. Neither oil is a curse in itself, nor is socialism a recipe for disaster. Instead, the combination of an incoherent socialist program aimed not at controlling the means of production, but at increasing consumption, made classic petrostate problems, dependency on debt and imports, all the more severe, drawing from the worst features of each. Yet, there's comfort in blaming either oil or socialism exclusively for Venezuela's crisis. Both have elements of truth. They're also incomplete, mainly because neither seeks to explain so much as to blame or absolve for reasons of political gamesmanship. This is the final conclusion. Those who offer up the petrostate do so to shift attention away from Chavez, aiming to burnish his image and political appeal for posterity by shielding gains made during his government from the crisis that his policies have left after his death. Meanwhile, those who blame socialism willfully downplay how policies very familiar to previous boom eras, policies undertaken by governments of very different stripes before, drive the current crisis. Instead, they seek to keep alive the claim that many have tried and failed before. that Venezuela's chief barrier to lasting prosperity is its leaders and their management of oil dependency, not dependency itself. So if we come back to power, we will know what to do with the oil revenues, unlike they did. Ultimately, what the battle over incomplete explanations highlights is a more fundamental and troubling feature of Venezuelans' political culture. And I'm curious to see if this is what would figure in that political culture variable in that series. One that helps answer why, despite such clear lessons, Venezuela again and again finds itself in familiar predicaments. And that is, the seeds of the next crisis are found in the throes of the previous crisis. When rather than explanations, Venezuelans seek to blame. And again, blame has meant dismissing all that has come before for reasons of political survival, in the process discarding even the ability to learn from the past. Quote, a hysterical country subject to infernal repetition, unquote, is how Venezuelan novelist Federico Vega summarized his homeland in 2004. Petrostate logic may indeed account for the cyclical boom and bust cycles, but what makes Venezuela's repetition infernal is that each time it brings greater highs and deeper lows, despite the clear lessons each moment leaves in its wake. It's why Venezuela will be here again, not because it depends on oil, but because it depends on self-delusion about the reasons for its misery and about its possible solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. So before we open the floor for questions and comments, I'll ask our colleague Hannah Whitman, who is the discussant, and help us to organize this richness of material here.
Right. So thanks to all three of you. That was a very rich set of papers, and there's certainly a lot to talk about. I think I'll just offer a few brief comments on each of the papers, and then I think hopefully that will set the stage for some broad discussion. You know, Max took us at the 30,000 feet level, comparing all the countries and, you know, their structural conditions and the processes that each of them went through. I really appreciated that attention to, you know, what are the historical connections to global empire that have set up a certain political process that either repeats itself or, you know, at a certain point shifts over time. And one of the questions that I was left with is, you know, as we look into the current conjuncture, how do we maintain an attention to that link to the global economy and how those political processes change? I think there's, you know, we just started getting into that a little bit with the idea of the commodity booms that are happening currently, and who controls investment in relation to those commodity booms in each of the countries that we're discussing. So that would be one area that I think we could really dig in deeper. What are not just the local political processes happening at the municipal levels or at the electoral level, but how are those processes in turn informed by connections to global capital? And then in relation to that question, what are the needs of that global capital in terms of the populace? So as Latin America shifted from a labor-intensive economy to a technology-intensive economy, I'm thinking of, you know, shift from agriculture exports to, which have become increasingly mechanized and therefore dispossessing a lot of labor back into the cities. That's created a sense of political unrest where you have capital investment in oil extraction and mining and these sort of things that have really changed the way that labor politics happen in Latin America as well. And so as you turn to discussing the politics of citizenship and inclusion, it really struck me about how do we talk about the scale basis of citizenship? We have participatory budgeting happening at, you know, municipal levels. We have you know, constitutional assemblies happening in places like Ecuador, where there was this very kind of rich sense of popular contribution to the shape and the emerging ideologies. But the point at which those get put into practice require investment in institutions. And so when those institutions don't, then when they're not allowed to function, then that sense of participation, I think, can move to that sort of level of disillusionment that you really started to bring up in your paper. So I think a question that I'm left with kind of at the end of Max's paper is what is that, how do we juxtapose the sense and the desire for popular participation that came about really, loudly in the left turn with the levels of insertion into the global economy and the structural constraints that places on the ability of popular participation to be effective. So Leslie sort of took us from there saying, well, we have these kind of ideological shifts happening at the level of legislation and elections and new constitutions in many of these countries. Well, what does that mean in terms of material outcomes? And I think just with that very brief overview of some of the data that is collected, and I think we can have a separate methodological discussion on what that kind of data actually captures vis-a-vis what people are feeling on the ground in terms of their daily life and how they feel that that has changed or not changed. I think I'll leave that methodological question to the side for now. But the question I started to ask in this one is it the ideology that's the problem, or is it the context in which it operates? So there was kind of both Max and Leslie were comparing two sets of questions and sort of looking at different outcomes. The outcomes didn't really change according, when you're looking at your slides, it didn't really matter whether you're in the left turn or not. The outcomes didn't really change. So if we're looking at global structural constraints to, equitable development and wealth redistribution, if ideology has no attachment to material reality, what does that actually mean? Is it the ideology that's the problem, or is it the way in which that's operationalized? And so I think that operationalization of the left turn, the extent to which redistribution was possible because of redistribution of oil rents or that sort of thing, then that's not really sustainable in the long term. So what is investment being used for? What is the source of that investment, and how does that or not lead to structural change? Again, I think in your paper on Venezuela, you really brought that up in terms of what is able to be changed in the countryside. What is investment being used for? And I just come from Ecuador, and I spend a lot of time in Brazil, where investments are being used to prop up the export economy. And when and if there is a tiny surplus, that there's some punctual investments in small social programs. But if you look at the actual extent of those investments to the wider populace, they're not really feeling it. So they're more it's more rhetoric than reality. And then the really rich paper about Venezuela, I think it's really interesting to see. I think you're right about the dystopian coverage and what people hear and don't hear about what's happening. Life does go on amongst the crisis, but those experiences differ for different sectors of the population. So as we talk about the operationalization or the kind of the experience of these left turns, this looking at the popular sectors and kind of the social movements that have been involved in these struggles over the years, and the highs and lows of even their psychological experience of change, this high hopes, and then these sense of, oh my goodness, something is really changing, and then the re-entrenchment, and then the becoming the opposition to politicians who are your former allies, and just the kind of the confusion of all that, I think really is striking and has led to some political paralysis. I think there's strong parallels to be made with what's happening in the United States with these cycles of change for change's sake, rather than change towards a particular thing. So, the revolts in Brazil against Dilma's government weren't about her ideology. They were about a feeling of disillusionment. Like things weren't changing the way they wanted them to change, but nobody was really clear about what the change was that they wanted. So I think trying to tease out what is it that people are feeling disillusioned about, and then how that translates into political processes that aren't necessarily in the best interest of the people who are protesting. You've seen that in various of these countries going forward. I really appreciated your vignette about the institutions, and And just to reiterate, the participatory mechanisms of governance only work when they're embedded in a system that acknowledges their power. So you can have participatory mechanisms, but if they're not funded, if the budget doesn't come, I was just in Ecuador, and there's been a big deal made of social programs and infant daycare centers and school lunch programs, and they're not being funded, so they're just not happening. So that they appear to be happening, but they're not happening. So it's the immaterial delivery of these promises that I think really is contributing to the sense of disillusionment, and then also demobilization, because people don't know how to mobilize. They asked for things, and those things were quote unquote given, but then they weren't given. So it's like, how do you become in opposition to your own, to the ideology that you subscribe to? So I think in sum total, these papers focused on the historical, structural, and process-based context of political change. And I think looking at the parallels, not only within Latin America, but also in other countries throughout the world, are also attached to, the empires of global capital, and the way in which that, I think, is shaping the political processes, I think, is worth probably some good discussion.
Thank you. According to the original plan, this session was supposed to finish 10 to 12, but I think we started a little bit late. So should we keep it until noon? Is that okay? Mm-hmm. All right. So, yeah, we have quite a bit of time then. The floor is open for questions to the members of the panel or to general commentary. No interest, the session is closed.
The thing, those are three, I mean, like kind of said, that we have this kind of, this starting from 30,000 feet, going to 20,000 feet, and then going sort of underground. And I think there was a very interesting kind of conversation going on between these papers. And I want to start off with a question that's with Alejandro, but I guess I would like to see it expanded more broadly. I mean, in the things that all of you are describing in terms of various kinds of existential crises, but also a crisis of left governance that Leslie is sort of on some level positing that the governance from the left and governance from the right were not significantly different in this period that we talk about left and right. I'm really, as a historian, like myself, I'm really reminded of this moment that many of us, I think, thought was deeply buried in the past. In the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, when a complete, and disgust is the kind of the language that was often mobilized, a disgust with civilian politicians across Latin America, a sense that they were completely corrupt, a sense that they were unable to govern, they were nihilistic, led to a significant political turn. It was cross-class towards thinking that that Latin American countries needed saviors, and that those saviors had to come from various patriotic people who were true patriots, and that they turned, and that significant sectors of the population turned to the military as patriots who would come in and who would clean out the system, because the system itself was incapable of reforming itself. And so one of the things that we live in right now is that I think that kind of sentiment is not really viable in the 21st century, because we all know that the military leaders, they were just as bad as, in fact, in many cases, far worse. I mean, in terms of the practices they do. So that alternative doesn't really sort of exist, right? So when you're looking, this is my question really for you, but when you're looking at this kind of despair, right? This kind of despair about cyclical, this idea that we're trapped in this cycle that is either because of the complete corruption of our politicians, or the complete dependence on how does that despair resolve itself in an alternative, right? Like this will be the alternative that we see as a way forward, especially if I just don't think that there's any kind of traction for people saying, well, we'll turn to the military. Maybe in some context. So where is that? Like, what is the?
Should we respond? Do you want to collect the questions, or Okay, so that's for Alejandro. Gerardo?
I have two fairly precise questions, one for Max and one for Alejandro. For Max, I mean, this last pattern that you talked about the countries where we do not observe left turns, which are also the ones with the strongest colonial backgrounds. Would you say that's because there's a sort of excess of state? There is revision, I mean, can you elaborate on that? And for Alejandro, a very precise question too. You asserted that what I guess the question is, why do you claim that the opposition has learned nothing?
My favorite question.
Anybody else? Yes, please.
Well, I studied corruption in Brazil for a long time, and my question is about accountability solutions. That I know that the black government in Brazil invested a lot in strengthening accountability solutions. I would like to know if this is the case for all the left countries, and if you see a difference from countries from the right and from the left in the investment in accountability.
Okay, yes, and then.
I agree that these were really three great presentations to get us started. I have a question with each. Lots of questions. Max, you know that I'm very sympathetic to this kind of big macro comparative historical analysis. My sense is that if you want to make it work in the ways that it worked for the Colliers, you need to be able to make the argument, not that these cases necessarily come out the way the model would predict, but rather that they come out more in that direction than they would otherwise, right? In that argument from chapter 1. And I raise that because when I look at the last boxes and the way in which you presented Costa Rica and Chile as relatively successful cases of participation in the left turn or late left turn, I don't think either are filling that box anymore. And so for me to be convinced by that, I would need to hear the argument that they are more like that than they would otherwise have been. And I'm not sure of that, but I think that one way to understand why it is that they are terribly underperforming in terms of the citizen engagement and avenues for effective institutionalized participation has to do with the point that Hannah was making about insertion into the broader global economy. And it's not just commodity-based, as you would look at the Costa Rican case. Costa Rica has the same problem that Chile does. Solis has the same problem that Bachelet has, is that the social basis for a transformative project has been broken down and the institutions that it would have drawn upon have eroded. And that, I think, has to do with the degree to which capital and government, those who govern, are oriented toward figuring out how to manage open economies. And I think that's a structural question. Leslie, fascinating, but here's a question. Is it not the case that really what we're seeing here is that region-wide we have a reduction in the returns to primarily secondary education, the less given of this power argument. And that is particularly the case where you have periods of relatively rapid and sustained growth, like Peru and Chile, and probably after Bolivia. A case like Brazil doesn't have quite as rapid and sustained growth, but it certainly does compared to Mexico, which would explain why its improvement on these distributed indicators is somewhat better. And what it did have was, through the left turn, a larger complementary and only less impactful, but somewhat impactful, investment in social programs, cash transfers and all that. And that issue of rapidness of growth, perhaps propelled a little more by those kinds of social policies, is what helps you to understand advances rather than left-right. But fundamentally, it's about rates in sustaining of economic growth? That's the question. For Alejandro, I was thinking that I was going to disagree with you when you were saying that, well, resource curse is a misleading way to think of it, until you said actually, to understand where we are now, it's the resource curse in the context of a particular kind of socialist project. I think that makes absolutely good sense. Here's the question. Might it be the case that that combination makes the regime transition or the next phase radically more complicated? Mike McCarthy has a hypothesis that he uses against my trying to use a Schmitter and O'Donnell frame for understanding Venezuela. So the classic Schmitter and O'Donnell frame is that what we would have now is a kind of negotiation between sectors of the food, the old adeptos would come back, would enter into some kind of negotiation between people in the administration who don't want a complete confrontation. And that in the process, they would go isolating the kind of the Leopoldo Lopez on one side and some question mark, we're not sure who, hardliners in the regime. Mike's argument is that can't happen because this is not a classic Latin American circumstance. What this is a resource curse case combined with a particular kind of socialist project, which creates an entrenched group that will fight to the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have the two colleagues here, you first and then you. Yep.
Yeah, my question / comment is to Leslie. After looking at the graphics, I was thinking that before we used to characterize the left based on the inward economic model that it brings. But after seeing your graphs, I remember reading during the left turn, Eastern Roberts saying that the left has a monopoly, or at least it claims a particular emphasis on redistribution, social policies. But after seeing your graphs, it sounds like you cannot argue that. Actually, countries that did not do the left turn, such as Colombia and Peru, have performed and have put emphasis on that as much as the leftist countries, and even perform better in that aspect. So can we still say, or can we claim that the left has a monopoly on something, or what is the agenda that remains there that is particular of the left?
Thank you. Yeah.
One comment about the presentation of Leslie. So it is true, and I agree, and actually the data shows that one of the limits of Latin American countries and the left was that they couldn't actually make a structural change in the economy in the sense of closeness, etc., right? So we are still exporting, and the primary sector is, the major sector, right? And then the tertiary sector as well, service sector. So, that is very true. We didn't make a convergence in terms of GDP with the central countries, but still I would like to pose that, for example, in terms of informal economy, leftist governments did actually quite better, maybe if we measure the median, than right governments. Also, the same for the levels of unionization, which actually affected as well the minimum wage. So in that sense, I would say, well, of course, there are structural limitations, right, that the left is showing, and that is a reason for the existence of the left as well, right, and the discontent of middle classes, etc. But I think that we should also take on these kind of points, which are a main point of the left agenda, now and before, right? So you're answering my question. Okay. And one comment for Max, I think that this is very, really interesting, and if someone just take a look on this, right, and say, well, Costa Rica and Uruguay, for example, are doing better in terms of human development. One can say, well, they are liberal representative democracy, they have this kind of structure. I mean, if someone is like really bad, right, or mean and wants like to push something, it could say, well, whether like this your argument has a problem of endogeneity, right? And I think you really can solve that. You already did in the sense that, well, you are making this from a path dependence perspective, right? So you are pointing the critical junctures and so on. But I was thinking whether it would be like good to think in terms of human development, right? But including in this kind of human development, not just like welfare state dimensions of decommodifications, but also whether the mechanisms for including the voice and citizenship decision-making should be considered in human development. So what I'm trying to say is, like, for example, Bolivia and Brazil, that they are having like the involvement of the citizenship in the management of the economy, right, through participatory innovations. Like, I think that that's really empowering individuals and collectives, right? So, and that is showing another kind of animal, which is not like, as my country has in Uruguay, right? Like just like a liberal representative democracy. So that may be in a way more democratic, right? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. So shall we proceed in the same original order then? No?
Okay. Excuse me. Well, thank you all. This has been a very rich conversation, and I've learned an enormous amount from it. And so I'd like to respond to a couple of things, but I think it'd be easier for me to start by saying, if I could, a couple of things about Alejandro, because I think it really illustrates part of the point that I was trying to make with my presentation. So one of the things that seems to me is relevant to this debate about whether the problem is the petrol state or socialism. When I look at Venezuela, I would argue that it is an example of a country that has had enormous difficulty establishing stable, enduring pacts of domination. In fact, it is one of the countries that is most unstable in the 19th century. It develops an oligarchic state very late, and it only becomes a kind of stable state under Gomez with the discovery of oil. The Pacto Punto Fijo is clearly underpinned as well by oil, and the first years of the Chavez period are underpinned by the production of oil and the increased price of oil. And so I think in some ways it's worth thinking about Venezuela comparatively in relation to countries like Argentina, which is another great example of a country. You think of the O'Donnell State Alliances argument, which also works rather well for thinking about Bolivia, right? In both cases, you get fractions of the entrepreneurial class that are at odds with each other. You cannot agree on a set of rules of the game for sort of establishing political order. In the Venezuelan case, I mean, one sort of clear manifestation of that is the absence of an entrepreneurial bourgeoisie. Right? This is a country that really doesn't have a capitalist class, and I think it's precisely because of the incredible importance of oil, and that makes it so vulnerable when the price of oil goes down to these kinds of deep crises. And I think it is currently in a very, it's as you said, very deep, not only economic crisis, but crisis of political order. And so I think that really sort of underscores the critical importance as we analyze these cases of asking, is there an underlying pact of domination that is enduring and that has then the capacity for the development of institutions that can endure? And I think the really key point here is that in those countries in which you have these sort of periodic crises, and think about Argentina, 1999, 2001, think about Bolivia with catastrophic sort of impasse in 2005, 2006. those moments of crisis, if the left comes to power at that point, that produces a very different kind of dynamic than the sort of election of the left in normal times in a country where the underlying pact of domination is stable. I think that's the critical thing about countries like Costa Rica, Uruguay, and Chile is the pact of domination is very strong, it's very stable, and it's clearly connected to the fact that there are powerful entrepreneurial elites in those countries. So part of the question is, how do we create institutions that have a capacity, right? And this goes to sort of to Domi's point, I think, that have the kind of capacity for inclusion and for making sustainable investments in welfare, but not just in welfare, as I think Domi rightly points out, in building, creating mechanisms of political participation or incorporation that over time can lead to both improvements in the kinds of fundamental rights and freedoms that are necessary to sustain a democracy, as well as in the possibilities for providing for the kind of prosperity and for sharing prosperity in the society. So I think this goes a bit to Eric's question. To my mind, a big difference in the different countries of the region at the moment of the introduction of neoliberal policies is that there are a set of countries that adopt neoliberal policies in the context of relatively robust institutions, and they can absorb the inevitably harsh economic consequences that has. And it's not to say that those consequences aren't significant and in many cases very painful, but there are other countries in which the adoption of those policies in the absence of institutions that it would enable people to survive and be successful in the context of neoliberalism. There, I think the consequences can be absolutely devastating, right? And so there are the effects of neoliberalism are very heavily from one context to another. And I think this is where I see, notwithstanding important differences between countries like Chile, Uruguay, and Costa Rica, nonetheless, all having a capacity to sustain viable systems of governance in the context of the pressures of globalization, whereas it's much less clear that that's the case in Venezuela or Bolivia. Bolivia is an interesting.
I'm so sorry. Could I just ask? Institutions is that's a very broad category. Could you please specify a little bit what you're actually talking about here when you mention institutions?
Yeah. So I think there are part of it is the state, right? So how robust is the state? What kind of capacity does the state have? The ability to administer things, basically the capacity to manage the economy, but also I think that the presence of a strong state creates the possibility of a sort of a broader infrastructure for participation in markets and in self-government in democracy. And so it's states that have the capacity to make, this is the Domi's point, make investments in human development, right? Schools, clinics, roads, basically kind of the basic infrastructure, keeping the lights on, keeping the roads paved, but also ensuring that the population is reasonably healthy, that diseases aren't spreading, right? Those sort of fundamental abilities of states, right, I think is really the critical thing here. And the weakness of all economic development models in the region that's always been the Achilles heel, whether it's the adoption of import substituting industrialization or whether it's adoption of neoliberalism. Weak states is a generic problem. And it's actually weak states, I think, that is the consequence of the kind of pattern of development that begins with the kind of system of domination that emerges in countries that were important to the colonial enterprise that are highly extractivist, that rely on labor-repressive agriculture, that have substantial indigenous populations. And the challenge there of building states and building inclusive citizenship and creating the conditions for sustainable prosperity, and in that context are just much, much greater than in the context of relatively small, homogeneous, peripheral kinds of countries like Costa Rica, Uruguay. Let me just, if I could, just to finish then. So for Ana Luisa's point, I mean, I think one of the things that we're seeing is mechanisms of horizontal accountability have improved all over the region, to the point that the recent thematic issue in the Journal of Democracy and Delegate of Democracy kind of comes to the conclusion that in many countries in the region, there are now greater deficits in vertical accountability than in horizontal accountability. Hagopian has a wonderful piece on Brazil, but you know, what's very interesting about looking at a country like Peru is that you have some improvements in horizontal accountability, but the government is so constrained by the power of the economic elite, and the society is so weakened in terms of social movements and political parties that the capacity to actually change the direction of the government as a consequence of elections is minuscule, right? I mean, you elect a variety of different politicians from a variety of different parties, and they all essentially have the government's on autopilot, with technocrats essentially continuing the neoliberal economic policy orientation. So I do think that that'll be my final point, is the neoliberal, the era of neoliberalism and democracy. I mean, and I think that it's critical that these two things come together in Latin America, because I think Alec is absolutely right. Coups are sort of off the table. So the kind of politics that we see in the past, the sort of crises that we've seen in Brazil or Venezuela would have led to coups. That doesn't happen in the current era. Those are sort of not off the table, and partly it does have to do with the strength of demands for human rights, the greater mobilization of civil society, the lack of prestige of the armed forces, and so forth. But the reality is that there are conditions that are imposed, or constraints that are imposed on the region by virtue of this current era of neoliberalism and democracy that really limit how these kinds of crises can be managed. And that goes, I guess, to the point about citizenship engagement and so forth. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Leslie?
Yes, thank you. Actually, first I have to say, I was thrown a little bit off my stride. My purse disappeared just before my talk. If anyone's seen it, it's a sling over. It's small. It's more like a pouch kind of thing. I can't find it. It's got, of course, my phone and all my cards in it. So hopefully it's on the floor somewhere. It's black. There's about 3 zippers. So, okay. I took this out, I put it down somewhere around here, I think, but maybe I can, all right. So yeah, a lot to respond to. Great. I just wanted to clarify, I was saying actually 2 things, and I probably hit harder on one, and maybe the other didn't come out as much. The data I have go from mostly around 2000 to the present, so more or less 15, 16 years. And it is true that, to my surprise, I didn't find a clear difference, particularly on the social outcomes between left and right. That is the finding that everybody heard. But the other finding is that somehow or other, virtually all the countries improved quite a bit, or not in a trivial amount. It's only a 15-year period. So that is something to keep in mind as well. And we don't have to be quite as pessimistic as we might be. And it's quite possible that the difference between institutionalized or more institutionalized mass democracy and successful pressure from below in all the countries, whether they have right or left governments. I want to pick up on Hannah's comment, not for me, but I think it was for Max, or maybe it was for Alejandro, I don't know, but the comment about what about what's going on, I guess it was for me too, in the global economy, sort of big structural changes, sure, which is certainly one reason why you would see somewhat similar outcomes in countries with governments with different political commitments. The one thing we haven't mentioned, and the other alternative when I was thinking, what do I want to say at this conference, is just to write about foreign policy. I decided not to, but the big difference, particularly for South America, which is mostly what I work on, the big difference, of course, is China. This is not just an economic difference, which we tend to think about, it's also a political difference. I mean, if you look a whole range of power capabilities, the world is becoming more multipolar. It hasn't happened yet, but depending on what you look at, I mean, if you look in PPP terms, clearly China is a bigger economy than the US. Certainly it's around the same size now. And as of about 2009, China became the major trading partner for most of the countries in South America. That's huge. And is going to change things, has changed things, is going to change things more. And of course, now it's the source of foreign investment. Eric, if I understood what you said, because it was complex and thoughtful, you said, gee, maybe the reason that Peru, Chile, and Brazil all seem to have improved their social outcomes was that there were two different things going on. Obviously, there are lots of things going on, but possibly an explanation for the more right-leaning Peru and Chile governments would be economic growth, and the explanation in Brazil, which had relatively steady growth until recently, but much lower, would be social programs. Yes, agreed. And there's more to be said, but I'll leave it at that. Question about what we mean by the left. I don't know your name, but just to your left. Do we mean what do we mean by left policies? Yes, you're quite right. I think that it used to mean ISI, and now since what, 80s, 90s, and the liberal era, as everyone says, it presumably it means more acute, more focused attention on social programs and social outcomes and political inclusion and also social and economic inclusion. So and if that's, you identify that as Levitsky and Roberts, but I think that's probably true. That is what's different about the left. I certainly assumed that when I was saying, what are left policies? I got a couple more quick comments. Max was talking about institutions and John Query can, I also study international relations, and I know the sort of IR literature, and the phrase in the IR literature that I think we're groping for is the compromise of embedded liberalism. In other words, has Latin America reached the stage of economic growth, of democratization, and so on, in which countries can participate in the global economy with all its vagaries and still protect basic social and economic outcomes for its citizens. And I think we're getting closer. I mean, I do think there's been progress. I guess I'll stop.
Thank you. Alejandro?
Great. Thank you. I'm just trying to put some of this stuff together. Let's see. So I don't know that I'll be able to respond to everything particularly, so maybe you'll hear yourself alluded to in what I'm about to say. So this is precisely the point that I was trying to address, Alec, which is the issue that you're describing. What I thought and perceived as different. And I realize that this is unquantifiable data. It's anecdotal, but I think that there's value in that. Especially at this moment when the numbers betray an experience on the ground that sometimes is far deeper felt than what numbers themselves can capture. It's precisely that lack of an alternative, and not just a lack of an alternative, but a lack of imagining an alternative that seemed to be so pervasively paralyzing. And what's more, speaking to Gerardo's question, that's what linked people from the opposition that I spoke with and people from that identify themselves as government supporters. So I gave a talk at the Universidad Católica, which is a bastion of the opposition, about popular politics and whatnot. And the question that I always ask in this context is, well, how many of you have set foot in this neighborhood, which is less than a mile away? And only 3 hands went up in a crowd of about 75 people, right? Sort of this lack of participating in the same spaces creates very similar dynamics, because the kind of echo chamber that leads to is a sense whereby, in the case of the opposition supporters, they feel let down by a weak leadership, which is the mood in this case, which is the same as the opposition, as the government supporters. They feel completely let down, right? Which speaks to a slightly different dynamic to point, Max. I've been reading O'Donnell a lot lately, and his classic essay on modernization of military coups, to the point about whether or not there are coups are an option. The argument that he makes there, one of the arguments that he makes there, is that zero-sum politics lead eventually to a consensus of termination, right? A consensus of termination of the zero-sum politics. But then that's where an institution, in this case like the military, can burnish its ostensible credentials as having some sort of internal order, as opposed to political parties and the rest of it, and sort of steps in to fill that vacuum when there's a consensus determination, both among some political popular sectors as well as elite sectors. 2 things that betray that example in the case of Venezuela. Number one, the military is completely discredited, much like I suspect the Argentinian military was discredited after the in the 1980s. And so the appeal that outcome has isn't one about apego to democratic principles. It's one about just the rejection of the institution itself. Right? So my sense is not that people aren't demanding a military coup because they're like, well, we don't want the military. I feel like they would if they felt like the military had some credibility. Right, so I think that's a significant difference. Not to sort of valorize the idea that the military is not part of the picture. But to Eric's question about Mike's thesis, which I agree with, except for the fact that I think Mike goes too far the other way, saying this isn't an oil story. I think that it is an oil story. It's an oil story plus, right? But the issue is the military can present itself as an alternative in other ways, and especially in the context of Venezuela, where one of the things that has played out, certainly over the last 5-6 years, is the threat of organized popular sectors who are armed, the so-called colectivos, the so-called paramilitaries on the ground who are going to ravage our middle-class communities and rape our women and God knows what else, right? The military, through programs like this Operativo Liberación a la Patria, the OLPs, which was basically just going into poor communities and mano dura, killing a mansalva. It was just a massacre in Barlovento, which is a primarily Afro-descendant community, and the 12 youth were killed. Almost none of them had any kind of record. Anyway, the point is that they can assert their presence in a negotiated scenario where they say, well, we will be the ones who will step in to control the most radical sectors of the government, the colectivos. Right? So that's the bargaining chip that they have in that context. And so, but that has nothing to do with socialism per se, right, or an ideological position. It has everything to do with, well, what is it that I have that they need, that I can negotiate with and bargain with, right? So I don't think in that sense it's an ideological story. But it also gets at another point, which is, that even if military coups are off the table, there are other examples through which anti-democratic mechanisms can enter the scene to create alternatives or outcomes that don't necessarily read as anti-democratic, which gets to Gerardo's question about why do I say that the opposition has learned nothing? Well, there are some specific reasons why, and then there are some broader reasons why. The specific reasons is because if you look around sort of the entire sort of panoply of the mood, the opposition coalition, you will read nothing in terms of any kind of alternative. When there are alternatives, so the first comment that always comes out is, well, we can't have an alternative until there's we can't have economic alternatives until there's a political outcome. There's always like to your point about like change for change's sake, like we advocated change and then we'll tell you what's going on. It's like voting for Trump. Right? We'll vote for Trump and then we'll see what happens next, right? And that's where we are right now. But even when you do talk about some alternatives, there's no alternative to the Petrostate. None. The opposite is true. Right? The emerging response is the problem was the squandering of the boom, not the boom itself. Right? So that just one sort of off the bat in terms of not learning from the past, what is to be learned. Right? The other thing is there's continuing in terms of political pacts and whatnot. There's no unity. I remember with Mike actually a year ago, we're having this debate as well, saying, well, the opposition is doing its thing again. After a tremendous, win last December, it's now split off into all sorts of fractions. Like, no, they're united as united as they will ever be. And as we see now, of course, that's not the case. So, which then speaks to a different issue. There is something particular, and I don't want to, but I feel like I keep pulled back to the exceptionalist thesis of Venezuela. Before, Venezuela was held as an exceptional state because oil was the one that provided that vaunted stability, institutional stability, that then was revealed to be a house of cards, right? I think that there is a new exceptionalism rising, which says, oil is the thing that creates the impossibility of those institutions, but it does so in a very particular way, to bring back O'Donnell. Feeds and requires that zero-sum dynamic that then makes impossible any kind of consensus determination. It's the reason why the people in the Universidad Católica are not going to go to the popular sectors that I study, and vice versa. Right? That inability to imagine each other as part of this larger national project requires a sense that I'm speaking for these people or I'm speaking for those people, right? That's where we are, right? I think the story of Venezuela over the last 17 years, one of the ones that we need to talk a lot more about is how polarization became an institution in itself. And the institution, not just Venezuela, right? I mean, to lesser extent Bolivia, in other places, right? But polarization became the only game in town. That's how politics runs. And you can't create alternatives on the basis, certainly alternatives that are, as you suggest, lead to this, domination consensus or whatever, that allow for national popularity to emerge, right? So that's why in the case of Venezuela, I mean, I'm far less, sanguine, but I'm also really clear about that this isn't a story about, socialism comes into play and then that ruins everything, which is the underside of all this sort of sensationalist coverage, which is like, well, if only you'd been here in the 1980s, man, that would have been great. Which is just not true. It's patently false.
Can I ask a question? What's the link between oil and the what do you call it, the zero-sum? You said oil.
Oh, yes.
Dynamics.
Because the way that oil is distributed in Venezuela is through the national state. So whoever controls the national state controls the resources of oil and its distribution. And so the question in Venezuela, for instance, and this speaks to the issue of distrust that is the reason why my friend, I'm calling Robert here, why he says that he will never vote for the opposition, which also speaks to your point, by the way, which you didn't ask me, but the issue that you were asking, I think is a great one. What makes the left different in Latin America if the economic performance is similar? The left in Latin America bears the burden of expectation in a way that the right does not. They bear the burden of actually doing something better, different, more participatory. The right doesn't bear that burden. It doesn't have to. It doesn't have to make that appeal. It also therefore means that when those expectations fall short, the demoralization is deeper. And it leads to all sorts of political crises, right? Which is why, you can imagine the left is really active in moments of sort of right-wing resurgence and difficult to sort of manage those moments when it's in power. But anyways, that's all to say that, the expectation is that if the opposition comes to power, especially if it's a messy transition, if it's non-negotiated, that there will, despite all the caring about popular sectors right now, and people starving and the rest of it, whatever measures come are not going to be directed in terms of distributing the revenues of oil, especially if oil does continue its rise, are not going to be directed towards that. They will receive scraps, and that is the end of it. And that therefore reinforces the zero-sum dynamic, because I don't want them to come to power if that's what it means. Even though right now I'm having a really hard time finding it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the panels and the lucid questions. I think that we have come to the end of the session. I don't know whether Max or the organizers needs to.
I believe that they're bringing lunch. They should have brought it right around now. They might in fact be outside.